Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the live webinar on the Business Combinations Under Common Control project, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yulia Feykina, and I am a Senior Technical Manager with the ISB staff working on the Business Combinations Under Common Control project. I'm joined today by Anna Maria Frossi, a Visiting Fellow, and Satanik Vanyan, a Practice Fellow, also working on the project. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. The slide deck used in this webinar, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be available for download on our website. You will find them under the Supporting Material tab on the project page. We invite you to submit questions at any time during this webinar. To ask a question, type it into the designated text box on your screen and click Submit. We will aim to answer as many questions as possible at the end of our presentation. And finally, a reminder that the views expressed in today's webinar are those of the presenters and not necessarily those of the board or the IFRS Foundation. Now, let's look at what we are going to cover today. We will first walk you through the tentative decisions the board has made on the scope of the project and explain the thinking behind those decisions. To bring those decisions to life, we will then discuss illustrative examples of transactions that will be in the scope of the project. Finally, we will close this webinar with a questions and answers session. With that, I will hand it over to Satanik to take you through the early stages of the project.
Thank you, Yulia. Let me start by giving you a little bit of context. The project was first added to the ISB research agenda in 2012, following 2011-2012 agenda consultation. Respondents to that agenda consultation identified the project as a high priority research project. Following the results of agenda consultation, the staff commenced work on the project. The first topic the staff discussed with the board in 2014 was the scope of the project, specifically how broad the scope should be. At that time, some interested parties advocated a broad scope. They suggested that the board should take the opportunity to consider accounting for all related party transactions in general. A few others suggested that the board should consider the so-called new basis issues. In contrast, other interested parties objected to a broad scope. They urged the board to focus on the pervasive practice issues presented by business combinations under common control and group restructurings. The board decided to go with a narrower scope project, focusing on business combinations under common control and group restructurings. In making that decision, the board considered the feedback on the scope of the project received from its advisory body, the Accounting Standards Advisory Forum. The board also noted that IFRS standards do not generally contain scope exclusions for transactions under common control, apart from the scope exclusion in IFRS 3 for business combinations, and that these transactions, business combinations under common control and group restructurings, give rise to concerns about diversity in practice. In 2014, the board also decided to consider whether there is a need to clarify the description of business combinations under common control, including the meaning of common control. And finally, the board decided to give priority to considering transactions that affect third parties, for instance, those undertaken in preparation for an IPO. Those transactions are of a particular concern for securities regulators. Following the board's decision on scope, the staff continued their research and outreach activities. In 2015-2016, the board went through a second agenda consultation process. That agenda consultation again identified the project as important and urgent. In 2016, the project was then confirmed on the ISB active research agenda. The board resumed its discussion of the scope and in October and December 2017 decided to clarify the scope. Let's look at why the scope needed clarification. You will remember that the board's original decision was to focus on business combinations under common control and group restructurings. But is it really clear what this means? Let's look at both components of that decision in turn. Business combinations under common control are described in IFRS 3, and the standard describes them as business combinations in which all the combining entities or businesses are ultimately controlled by the same party or parties, both before and after the business combination, and that control is not transitory. So business combinations are defined in IFRS 3, so that aspect of the description is clear. But there are application questions about the meaning of common control, in particular the meaning of transitory control, and we will come back to them in a few minutes. Let's now look at group restructurings. Unlike business combinations under common control, group restructurings are not defined nor described in IFRS standards. Accordingly, the board needed to clarify what transactions, in addition to transactions that satisfy the description of business combinations under common control, will be considered in the scope of the project. I will now hand over to Anna to discuss how the board decided to clarify that.
Thanks, Satenik. And as Satenik just explained, group restructuring is not a defined term, and it is not described in IFRS standards. In fact, it might be understood differently by different parties. For example, some parties use that expression to refer to a wide range of transactions under common control, including business combination under common control, whereas other parties use that expression to refer to transactions under common control that involve a transfer of entities or businesses but that do not satisfy the description of business combination under common control. Now, if we consult a common dictionary for the definition of a restructuring, we will find the definition along the lines of organizing components of the whole in a different way. So in a context of a group, restructuring will then mean organizing entities or businesses within the group in a different way. And that will involve transferring control over entities or businesses between existing or newly created entities under common control. Now, such some transfer might satisfy the description of business combination under common control, whereas other may not. And it is that latter population that needed to be described more precisely. So let me illustrate the different types of transaction we are talking about with a couple of examples. So consider a scenario where entity A, entity B, and entity C are controlled by entity P. And suppose that entity A acquire entity C from entity B. Assuming that entity A is not an empty shell, this transfer satisfies the description of business combination under common control because it meets the definition of a business combination and the combination takes place between entities under common control. So this transaction is within the scope of the project in accordance with the board's original decision on the scope. Now, if we consider a similar transaction, except that in this scenario, entity P creates a new entity to acquire entity C from entity P. So this new co issues shares to entity B as consideration for the acquisition of entity C. Applying paragraph B18 of IFRS 3, a new co that issues shares to effect a combination cannot be identified as the acquirer. And entity C cannot be identified as the acquirer either, and this is because NewCo is not a business. It follows that the acquisition of entity C by the NewCo is not a business combination. Therefore, not a business combination under common control either. Nevertheless, this transaction involves transferring control over a business within a group, and is a case of group restructuring that is included in the scope of the project in accordance with the board's original decision on scope. So the board decided to describe the transaction in the scope of the project more precisely. And instead of referring to the unspecific notion of group restructuring, the board clarified that the scope of the project includes transaction under common control, in which a reporting entity obtains control of one or more businesses, but regardless of whether IFRS 3 would identify the reporting entity as the acquirer.
Anna, thank you for explaining the logic for the board's October 2017 clarification. Perhaps one further point to clarify for our audience. Why is that the board refers to the reporting entity that obtains control? What about other entities involved in the transaction?
Oh, that's a good point, Julia. Let me explain this. So the board focused on the accounting by the receiving entity because the accounting by the other entities involved in the transaction are covered by the IFRS standards. So, for example, if we look at the transaction from the perspective of the controlling party, well, that entity controls the same entities and businesses as before the transaction. And if there is a change in non-controlling interest because of the transaction, that accounting is covered by requirement in IFRS 10. Now, from the perspective of the transferring party, the transaction, which is the disposal of a subsidiary, is also covered by IFRS 10. Whereas finally, from the perspective of the transfer business, there is a change in its immediate controlling party, and this is covered by disclosure requirements in IAS 24.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. So we have now discussed group restructurings, but we have also mentioned that there are application questions about the meaning of common control. Satenik, could you please walk us through those questions and explain how the board decided to proceed?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Julia. There were a series of questions that came to the IFRS Interpretations Committee, including questions from security regulators that related to the meaning of transitory control. As we mentioned before, the description of business combinations under common control requires that the control over the combining parties is not transitory. However, there is no specific guidance in IFRS 3 or anywhere else in IFRS standards on the meaning of transitory control. Once again, let's use an example to illustrate questions raised. Consider a scenario where entity A and entity B are both controlled by entity P. Entity P wants to sell entity A and entity B through an IPO. And in preparation of the IPO, entity P forms a newco and transfers to that newco both entity A and entity B. Some interested parties raise the question whether this transaction is under common control. Some argue that entity P's control over newco is transitory, because entity P loses control over newco in the IPO. Under this view, the transaction is not a business combination under common control, and newco must apply the requirements in IFRS 3 to account for the acquisition of entity A and entity B. Other parties argue that entity P's control over newco is not transitory. Therefore, the transaction is a business combination under common control and is outside the scope of IFRS 3. In their view, transitory control involves an entity coming in and then back out of the group. They also argue that the substance of the transaction is the IPO of entity A and entity B, and that the introduction of the newco should not result in applying IFRS 3.
Thank you, Satenik. And again, just one point to clarify. Is this the only scenario where a question about transitory control might arise?
Thanks for asking, Julia. In fact, similar questions could also arise when a combination between entities controlled by the same party is either preceded by an external acquisition or both preceded by an external acquisition and then followed by an external sale of one or more of the combining entities or businesses.
Great. Thank you, Satenik. And can you now tell us about further questions raised with the IFRS Interpretation Committee?
Yes, sure. So the committee also received a submission that described a scenario similar to the one we just discussed. However, in this case, the acquisition of entity A and entity B by newco is conditional on the success of newco's IPO. If the IPO is not successful, the acquisition does not proceed. Again, some interested parties, including security regulators, raise a question whether this transaction is under common control. Some parties take the view that this transaction is not under common control and falls within the scope of IFRS 3. They argue that the business combination takes place after newco's IPO. Hence, entity B P no longer controls the combining entities at the time the combination is completed. Other parties also conclude that the transaction is not under common control, but this is because they consider entity P's control over NewCo to be transitory. And finally, other parties argue that the transaction is under common control and is outside the scope of IFRS 3. They argue that entity P's control over NewCo is not transitory. They also argue that the legal sequence of the transactions, the acquisition by NewCo and the IPO, is not relevant to the analysis. In their view, the substance of the transaction is an IPO of entity A and entity B, and accounting should reflect that substance. The board noted that the application questions we have just presented focused on the distinction between business combinations, accounted for applying IFRS 3, and business combinations under common control, excluded from the scope of IFRS 3. This distinction is important today because it influences how the transaction is accounted for. However, the board noted that as the project progresses, this distinction may not remain relevant. If the board decides that some or all business combinations under common control must be accounted for applying the acquisition method, the important distinction will be between these different transactions to which different methods could be applied. Therefore, instead of focusing on clarifying the distinction between business combinations and business combinations under common control, the board decided to focus on filling in the gaps in the accounting requirements for business combinations, including in the scope those transactions that give rise to application questions. In other words, the project is not going to address questions about the dividing line between business combination and business combination under common control, but instead is going to address the accounting for transactions that give rise to those questions. Accordingly, the board further clarified that the scope of the project also includes transactions that involve transfer of businesses under common control, and the transactions are preceded by an external acquisition, or followed by an external sale, or both preceded by an external acquisition and followed by an external sale of one or more of the combining parties. Finally, the board will also consider transactions that are conditional on a future sale of the combining parties, such as a sale in an IPO. And with that, I'll hand over to Julia for final remarks on the scope.
Thank you, Satanik. So just to recap, what is in the scope? So we will be looking at transfers of entities or businesses under common control, regardless of whether those transactions meet the definition of a business combination, regardless of whether they are preceded by or followed by an external acquisition or sale of some of the combining parties, and also regardless of whether such transactions are conditional on a future loss of control over the combining parties, for example, in an IPO. When looking at those transactions, we will be focusing on accounting by the receiving party, regardless of whether that party would be identified as the acquirer if IFRS 3 were applied to that transaction. With that, I'll hand it over to Anna, who will take you through examples that illustrate transactions included in the scope of the project.
Thank you, Julia. And the idea of this final part of the presentation is really to bring board decision into life. So let's start with a very basic example. This slide illustrates a scenario where entity A and entity B are both businesses and both controlled by entity P. So entity A acquires entity B. And this transaction is a transaction under common control, and it involves a transfer of control over a business. The receiving entity, entity A, is also a business and can be identified as the acquirer. So accordingly, this transaction is a business combination that satisfies the description of a business combination under common control, and the accounting for this transaction in entity A's financial statement is in the scope of the project. But please know that this transaction will be in the scope of the project regardless of whether the combining party are fully owned by entity P or there is any non-controlling interest, or the combining party are listed or privately held.
Oh, thank you, Anna. This is quite a simple example. And again, just one point to clarify. So we stated that early in 2015, the board decided that the project should give priority to considering transactions that affect third parties. Can you please explain how this fits with the scenarios you've just described?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking, Julia. So the board indeed decided to give priorities to such transactions. However, the board did not restrict the scope of the project to such transactions only. So the project will consider transfers of businesses under common control in respective of whether those transfers affect non-controlling shareholders or providers of debt or take place in connection with a planned IPO. So moving to a slightly different example. This slide illustrates the same starting point as in the previous example, so entity A and entity B, both businesses and both controlled by entity P. However, in this scenario, the combination is effected through the formation of a new co. So entity P forms a new entity and then transfer entity A and entity B to this newly formed entity. Well, this transaction is also a transaction under common control, and it involves a transfer of control over two businesses, so entity A and entity B. So regardless which of the combining parties will be identified as the acquirer, the accounting for this transaction by the receiving entity, the NewCo, is in the scope of the project. And furthermore, in accordance with the board's decisions, this transaction is in the scope of the project regardless of whether the transaction is effected in preparation for an IPO or the transaction is conditional on the occurrence of a future sale of the combining party, such as in an IPO. In other words, in considering this scenario, we aim to address the application questions we discussed earlier. Well, the example on this slide is also related to the application questions we discussed earlier. So the starting point here is the same as in the previous example, except that entity B has just been acquired by entity P from an unrelated party. So subsequently, as in example 1, entity A acquires entity B from entity P. And the accounting in entity A's financial statements of the acquisition of entity B is in the scope of the project. And this is regardless of the fact that the acquisition of entity B by entity A is preceded by an external acquisition of entity B. So in other words, it doesn't matter if entity B has just been brought into the group or it was brought in some time ago or incorporated within the group. All those iterations will be considered within the scope of the project. Furthermore, it doesn't matter if the combining entities are sold outside the group after the combination, or if the combination is both preceded by an external acquisition and followed by an external sale of the combining parties. So once again, all those iterations will be considered in the project. Moving to our last example. So this slide illustrates a scenario where entity A, which is a business, is controlled by entity P. In this scenario, like in some of the previous examples, the combination is effected through the formation of a new co. So entity P forms a new entity and then transfer entity A to this newly formed entity. But please note that unlike the previous example we discussed, only one business is transferred in this combination. And depending on the facts and circumstances of the transaction, in this scenario, NewCo may or may not be identified as the acquirer. Therefore, considering that only one other combining entity is involved, this transaction may or may not meet the definition of business combination, but the transaction is in scope of the project anyway. and regardless of whether NewCo will be identified as the acquirer if IFRS 3 will apply to the transaction. And this concludes our discussion of illustrative examples. But before we move to the Q&A session, I'd like to point out that the examples we presented to you today were selected to illustrate particular aspects of a transaction and whether these aspects affect the inclusion of that transaction within the scope of the project. For example, the existence of non-controlling interest or the identification of the acquirer as defined in IFRS 3 or the occurrence of other transactions before or after the combination. And as discussed, all these aspects do not affect the fact that the transaction is in the scope of the project. And you can also overlay those aspects in a different way, and the transaction will still be in the scope of the project. For instance, if we use this last example, the transaction in this scenario is in the scope of the project, regardless of whether the combining entities are sold right after the transaction, or if entity A is listed, or entity A was just acquired by entity P, and so on. It's now time to turn to your questions. Julia, I'll pass on to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Right, and I would like to remind our audience once again that you can continue to submit questions at this time. Now, we have a couple of questions that relate to a particular transaction, acquisition of an associate from an entity under common control. And in fact, this topic has been recently discussed by IFRS Interpretation Committee. So the question is whether such transactions will be addressed in the scope of this project. Satani, could you please help us with this question?
Yes, of course, Julia, thank you. So first of all, let me remind you what question was raised in the submission to the Interpretations Committee. The committee was asked to clarify whether the scope exclusion in IFRS 3, the one for business combinations under common control, also applies to acquisitions of associates from an entities under common control. The committee debated this issue, but did not finalize an agenda decision. Some members suggested that it may be premature to finalize an agenda decision pending developments in the business combination under common control project. Now, in terms of the scope of this project, as we explained in this webinar, the project will consider transactions under common control that involve transfer of control over businesses. It will not consider other types of transfers under common control, including acquisitions of associates under common control. Nevertheless, in discussing the scope of the project, the board noted that there is an interaction between an accounting for transactions within the scope of the project and accounting for other transactions under common control, or related party transactions more broadly. So the staff will consider such interactions as the project progresses.
Okay, thank you very much, Satani. Now, there are a couple of questions that relate to financial statements that we will consider in this project, and in particular whether we will only be looking at consolidated financial statements or whether we would also address accounting in separate financial statements. Anna, could you please clarify that point for our audience?
Yeah, sure. So when the board clarified the original scope decision in October 2017, it did not specify to which financial statement of the reporting entity, so consolidated, separate, or individual, any accounting requirements developed in this project will apply. And this is consistent with how the scope is set out in IFRS 3. In fact, that standard also specifies which transaction it applies to, but does not specify which reporting entity's financial statement it applies to. And this is because the financial statements affected by any accounting requirements developed in this project will depend on the specific of the transaction. So, for example, if a reporting entity obtained control of a business that continues as a separate legal entity after the transaction, well, any requirements developed in this project will apply only in the reporting entity's consolidated financial statement. And why? Because in its separate financial statement, the reporting entity will account for the investments applying the requirement in IAS 27, which does not include any scope exclusion related to transaction under common control. But conversely, if the acquired business is not or does not continue as a separate entity after the transaction, well, any requirement developed in this project will apply in all financial statements prepared by the reporting entity, so consolidated or separate or individual.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. There are also a couple of questions sort of looking at a related aspect, which is, will we be looking at accounting by other parties involved in the transactions within the scope? So, for example, would we look at the accounting by a transferring entity? And this is something we already covered in this presentation, but just to reiterate, so in this project, we are only looking at the accounting by receiving entity. We are not looking at the accounting by transferor, transferred entity, or a controlling party. And this is because accounting by those parties is already addressed by IFRS standards. It is the accounting by receiving entity where we have a gap in the literature at the moment. Now, there are some questions in some shape or form related to our next steps in the project. Satanik, do you mind taking our audience through our plans?
Yes, sure. So let me start by reminding that this is a research project, and the board has not yet made decisions about the next due process document. So my update on next steps will reflect staff's expectations. Our expectation is that the next milestone in the project will be the publication of a discussion paper. Depending how the board discussions progress, we will be looking to publish discussion paper towards the end of 2018 or early in 2019. In the near future, we plan to continue discussing with the board the methods of accounting for transactions in the scope of the project. We started those discussions in December with an education session, and in the next few weeks, we plan to ask the board to decide which approach they would like to take in developing proposals for transactions within the scope of the project. For example, whether they would like to use the acquisition method as the starting point in the analysis, because this is method already described in IFRS 3 and is applied to business combinations not under common control, or whether they would like to use a different method as a starting point in the analysis given the scope exclusion in IFRS 3, such as, for instance, the so-called predecessor method that is commonly used in practice. So in the next few months, we plan to discuss with the board whether one or more than one accounting method should be applied to transactions within the scope of the project, and if more than one method is applied, how to draw the line between transactions that will be accounted for applying one method versus transactions that will be accounted for applying a different method or methods. And finally, depending on which methods the board decides to propose for transactions within the scope of the project, how those methods should be applied. So, for example, if the board decides that the so-called predecessor method should be applied for some of the transactions within the scope, the board would need to decide how that method should be applied.
Okay, thank you very much, Satanik. So this takes us to the end of our webinar. Thank you once again for your interest in the project and your participation in today's discussion. We hope this webinar has been helpful in explaining the scope of the project and the reasons behind the board's decision on the scope. We plan to organize further webinars in the future to keep you updated on the developments in the project. We will also be keeping our project page up to date so you can follow the developments as the project progresses. Many thanks again and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.